The 2016 Wisconsin Republican primary was held on April 5 in the U.S. state of Wisconsin as one of the Republican Party's primaries ahead of the 2016 presidential election. Texas Senator Ted Cruz won the contest with 48%, distancing nationwide frontrunner Donald Trump by 13%, taking advantage of the state's two-level winner-takes-all provision. Cruz took 36 out of the 42 available delegates. The Wisconsin Democratic primary, held on the same day in conjunction with the Republican primary, yielded a win for Bernie Sanders, who distanced nationwide frontrunner Hillary Clinton by 13%, with no other primaries being scheduled for that day by either party and just 2 weeks ahead of the important New York primary. The Wisconsin primary was in the national spotlight. The two parties' primaries were held in conjunction with this year's Wisconsin judicial elections, where Wisconsin Supreme Court Justice Rebecca Bradley was confirmed for a 10-year elected term, winning over appeals court judge Joanne Kloppenberg. Despite Ted Cruz's win, the eventual nominee, Donald Trump, went on to win the state on Election Day, held on November 8. Procedure. State primary procedure. As Wisconsin held an open primary, residents could choose freely which party's primary they wished to participate in when showing up at the polls on Election Day, regardless of their official registration with either party or none. Polling stations were opened between 7 a.m. and 8 p.m. Central Time. The two parties' primaries were held in conjunction with this year's Wisconsin judicial elections, that include the election of the Wisconsin Supreme Court Justice. Candidates. While 12 candidates appeared on the Republican primary ballot, only 3 of the candidates actively campaigned for the Wisconsin contest, after all other candidates had already suspended their campaigns. Presidential debate in Milwaukee, November 2015. The Republican Party held its fourth presidential debate on November 10, 2015 in Milwaukee, at the Milwaukee Theater, moderated by Neil Cavuto, Maria Bartiromo and Gerard Baker. The debate aired on the Fox Business Network and was sponsored by The Wall Street Journal. 8 candidates including Donald Trump, Ben Carson, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Jeb Bush, Carly Fiorina, John Kasich, and Rand Paul, participated in the primetime debate that was mostly focused on jobs, taxes, and the general health of the U.S. economy, as well as on domestic and international policy issues. The accompanying undercard debate featured Chris Christie, Mike Huckabee, Rick Santorum, and Bobby Jindal, who ended his campaign a week after the debate. Campaigns. Social conservative Texas Senator Ted Cruz, who enjoyed the endorsement of the United Republican Party establishment, including Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, was expected to come out in front. Opinion polling. Marco Rubio 0, 96%, Ben Carson 0, 51%, Jeb Bush 0, 28%, Rand Paul 0, 23%, Mike Huckabee 0, 13%, Chris Christie 0, 11%, Carly Fiorina 0, 07%, Rick Santorum 0, 05%, Jim Gilmore 0, 02%, Ben Carson 8%, Chris Christie 5%, Rand Paul 3%, Carly Fiorina 3%, Jeb Bush 2%, John Kasich 2%, Mike Huckabee 1%, Rick Santorum 0%, undecided 17%, Ted Cruz 9%, Jeb Bush 6%, Carly Fiorina 5%, Chris Christie 4%, Rand Paul 1%, Mike Huckabee 1%, John Kasich 1%, George Pataki less than 0.5%, Jim Gilmore less than 0.5%, someone else 0.6%, undecided 9.8%, Carly Fiorina 10.8%, Jeb Bush 6%, Ted Cruz 1%, Rand Paul 5%, Mike Huckabee 4%, Chris Christie 1%, John Kasich 8%, Rick Santorum 2%, Bobby Jindal 5%, George Pataki 4%, Jim Gilmore 2%, someone else 6%, undecided 8%, Ted Cruz 8%, Carly Fiorina 7%, Marco Rubio 7%, Jeb Bush 6%, Mike Huckabee 4%, Bobby Jindal 2%, Chris Christie 2%, Rand Paul 2%, Rick Perry 1%, John Kasich 1%, Jim Gilmore 1%, Rick Santorum 1%, George Pataki 0%, Lindsey Graham 0%, Ted Cruz 6%, Chris Christie 8%, Mike Huckabee 1%, Ben Carson 5%, Marco Rubio 8%, Bobby Jindal 3%, Rick Santorum 9%, Carly Fiorina 5%, Rick Perry 5%, someone else 7%, Dono 9%, Rand Paul 6%, Marco Rubio 6%, Chris Christie 4%, Mike Huckabee 3%, Ted Cruz 2%, Rick Perry 1%, undecided 5%, Mike Huckabee 8%, Rand Paul 8%, Ted Cruz 7%, Jeb Bush 6%, Marco Rubio 6%, Bobby Jindal 3%, someone else, not sure 8%, Chris Christie 6%, Rand Paul 4%, Ted Cruz 3%, Jeb Bush 4%, someone else 2%, Dono 9%, Marco Rubio 10%, Ted Cruz 9%, Jeb Bush 8%, Rand Paul 8%, Bobby Jindal 3%, Rick Santorum 3%, someone else, not sure 5%, Rand Paul 11%, Ted Cruz 10%, Marco Rubio 9%, Rick Santorum 6%, Bobby Jindal 3%, someone else, not sure 5%, Ted Cruz 10%, Rand Paul 10%, Marco Rubio 9%, Rick Santorum 4%, Bobby Jindal 2%, someone else, not sure 3%, Chris Christie 6%, Rand Paul 9%, Jeb Bush 6%, Bobby Jindal 8%, someone else 6%, don't know 5%, Rand Paul 8%, Mike Huckabee 7%, Jeb Bush 5%, Bobby Jindal 3%, Susana Martinez 1%, Rick Perry 1%, someone else, undecided 8%, Mike Huckabee 7%, Rand Paul 6%, Jeb Bush 5%, Bobby Jindal 3%, Susana Martinez 2%, Rick Perry 0%, someone else, undecided 8%. Results. With 48.25% of the statewide vote, Texas Senator Ted Cruz distanced nationwide frontrunner Donald Trump by some 13%, thereby winning all 18 at-large delegates. Reactions and aftermath. Cruz's unexpectedly large victory in Wisconsin was widely seen as a turning point for the Donald Trump campaign.